Hey there, good morning. Welcome to the Cory Morgan Show, Monday, June 7th. We got a good one today. In a little while, I'm going to have Clinton Desveaux come on. He's going to talk, we usually go on about federal politics, but this time we're going to be talking about what seems to be a trend, actually, of UFOs being reported and spotted by military, by commercial pilots. This has been happening for a lot of years, actually, and these reports now are becoming public. We're seeing more of it coming out of the States, and we're seeing it out of Canadian uh, documents and records. Now, whether or not it's little green men from Mars is questionable or doubtful, but really there is something going on. These guys are seeing things. And some of the questions are actually, is this a safety issue? Are there things that are putting people at risk while they fly? So that's going to be a different sort of conversation. We'll get away from our usual political ranting that I typically have with Clinton, though there'll be lots of politics on today as well. I'm going to have Renouf come on after that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him on social media. He's been very busy over the years. He reports on protesters, protests, almost like a Canadian Andy No, in a sense, but he doesn't get right in and get beaten up as poor Andy did, but he's tracks these protests, these protesters. He reports on them on social media because there's a lot that goes on that the mainstream media barely touches with these extremists and these lunatics that block legal developments and projects. So we've been hearing a little bit of news from the Fairy Creek protests that are going on in BC, where they're trying to do a logging project on Vancouver Island. Good old Tizora Berman, now that she's not, sucking tax dollars out of Alberta through Rachel Notley, is back to her activist roots and hoping to set up her own little war of the woods up there. And the rest of the usual suspects is claiming to speak for the local natives while the local natives are saying they don't speak for them. The arrogance of these white liberal environmentalists is always something to behold, actually. When confronted by the actual stakeholders, they tend to fall by the wayside. So that'll be a good chat with Greg. Now, I'll get in with our sponsors, too. We've got a couple in this show. And just that reminder, things are going great at the Standard. We're getting great readers, viewership. We really rely on those subscribers, advertisers. This is a publication that's been making great strides. We're reporting on stuff that the mainstream media doesn't cover, going more in depth with it. We got some fantastic columns in there, but we don't take any tax dollars. There's no subsidies. We aren't asking for them, and I'm pretty sure the government's not offering them. We're not really the friend of the establishment government anyway. So in order to keep media honest, keep things rolling, we rely on subscribers and we rely on our sponsors, and they've been coming through great. So be sure to let's all help each other here. So the CCFR, this is the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights, and today's show is brought to you by them. And nobody works as hard as the CCFR to fight for your ability to own and use firearms. So make sure to check out what the CCFR is doing by going to firearmsrights.ca and click Why Join Us, and they'll give you more information there on what they're up to. We've got to stand up for our own rights. We got to stand up for our property rights, our rights to have firearms. We do have that right. It's not entrenched like the United States, but it is a right. And there's some very strong efforts to take that right away from us. So the CCFR is out there working to protect that right and not let the state get away with taking away our firearms. Also, we have the Resistance Coffee Company. These guys are fun. They've been sponsoring us now for a couple of weeks. They've got a product out there. Are you tired of, woke political correctness, having it rammed down your throat everywhere you turn? Frustrated by businesses you support giving money to woke causes? Well, Resistance Coffee Company is here for you. And you can enjoy the wonderful taste of fresh roasted coffee with the knowledge that your money isn't funding the woke causes that you despise. In fact, Resistance Coffee gives 10% of every purchase to organizations that are fighting for the constitutional freedoms of Canadians. So yeah, this is the opposite of some of those companies. You go buy a Christmas gift for somebody or buy some sheets at a certain store or something, and then you find out that they've been donating money to causes that are trying to shut down Alberta or our industry or to political parties that really aren't friends of ours. Well, Resistance Coffee isn't doing that. They're donating to ones that actually stand up for our rights. So when you buy their coffee, 10% of your purchase, not only do it won't go to those rotten, crazed leftist causes, it's actually 10% of it's going to go to good causes that are going to help stand up for your rights. So when you go there, go to resistancecoffee.com, and they got a promo code you can enter. The promo code is Western Standard, all one word, and you get 10% off your first order. So you're just winning here. 10% of your purchase is going to go towards a good cause standing up for your rights, and you'll get 10% off the price. And they got some really creative coffee names there. I still love the one for the medium roast, which is called Liberal Tears. I don't think I would hope it doesn't literally taste like Liberal Tears, but there's some neat creative coffee types of things out there. And this is a good way we could push back. And these guys, again, they're sponsoring us. The way we can keep these media sources going, Resistance Coffee going, is by us getting out there, supporting each other. These businesses support us. Let's support them. I'm going to order some of those Liberal Tears and check it out. And make sure, again, use that promo code Western Standard, all one word. So before I get into, talking about the UFOs, what's this, Ruth Ann? A year ago, people said they would use UFOs to explain the rapture of Christ followers. That's an interesting one. If we see the people going up in rapture, they could appear as UFOs. That would be one explanation of things, I guess. And that's some of the fun, So be sure to comment, though. Bring things in. When it comes to UFOs, we've got a whole lot of theories and people with ideas on what those might be. Let's have a discussion. Let's talk about it. Are they aliens? Is it rapture? Is it governments testing out new aircraft? There are a number of things it could be. And let's chat about it. So, and I wanted to start it. I get tired of beating on Jason Kenney. It's just that the man can't seem to get it together. I guess when you take the big chair, you're going to take some of the troubles that come with it. But I can't help. I've got to address it again. Things are looking really ugly. It just keeps developing. We're clearly going into an outright caucus revolt now. Before we'd seen, Drew's been uncomfortable. Drew Barnes has been uncomfortable under Jason Kenney's leadership for some time, so that wasn't that shocking. Todd Loewen, more restrained, but it has always certainly been a small C conservative of the Wild Rose bent. Not too shocking. But now we've got Leela here coming out. That's a senior cabinet minister, critical of Premier Kenney's actions and behaviors, as well as Rajan Sawhney. He's another cabinet minister. And then now just breaking, we have Richard Gottfried has resigned his caucus chair. That's the second caucus chair. Todd Loewen was the last one in protest of Jason Kenney's leadership, particularly on the hypocrisy of the Sky Palace incident. I want to be positive with you guys. I was looking forward to the opening. Things were looking good. We've been beating on you guys all winter. And, hey, you've given us lots of stuff to beat you over the head with. But, hey, let's celebrate having a good summer coming. Maybe get some recovery, get your feet under you. Start perhaps beginning to become the government that you campaigned to us that you would be. And no, it's just one reactive crisis to another. So the Sky Palace thing, of course, everybody watching is familiar with it. Politicians often as well, they underestimate what symbolism can do, how powerful symbolism is. It can tear you down. The people dismissing it, saying it's just minor. Hey, you went out with 10 people in your patio, at home last week, perhaps, or something. Yeah, okay, but your average person isn't telling everybody else to lock down. Your average person hasn't made it illegal for other people to do business. They haven't made it illegal for people to go to church. They haven't made it illegal to sit down at a bar with a friend and have a drink. The Kenney government did. Now, it's debatable as to whether or not they should have illegalized that. That's a whole separate discussion, too. I certainly think they've locked down far more, and there's not much evidence that these lockdowns have really been that effective. But if you're going to go through those actions, you got to walk the bloody talk. And to be seen, of all places, do you guys come up with things to shoot yourselves in the feet? What more elitist spot could you possibly comprehend than the Sky Palace, to be seen with a white tablecloth table service meal you're having out on the patio for an afternoon? People say, oh, it's just a working supper. Look, we don't have working suppers like that. That, again, is where you're forgetting what your average person is dealing with right now. Our bosses, if we're working at all, aren't giving us table service on a patio. And lots of people have critiqued it. It's minor stuff. I don't think they're putting people at risk. People aren't going to die. But they were getting up, coming, going. They weren't masking. They've been kind of cherry picking on which rules were and weren't broken. Not a huge deal in the whole scope of things, but it's a massive deal in the optics and in the impression and just in the feel. And it's cost them dearly. Not only them doing it, but the response. No apologies. We did nothing wrong when we could see that they did something wrong. Guys, it's the age a video. We see it. We saw the pictures. We feel you did something wrong. Don't tell us we saw something else. Now that just pisses us off more. Kind of brings to mind way back to the date myself a little in the early 90s when the video things really started with that horrific Rodney King beating, where that poor man was just beaten half to death on the street. Somebody videotaped it and it went out to the world. But as if that wasn't horrifying enough, all of the officers who took part in that beating were acquitted. And that, again, is when all the apologists and excuses came out and said, no, you see, your eyes deceived you. You did not see cops misbehaving. They obviously didn't deserve the charges. We should let them go. Well, people didn't accept that, and LA burned for it, and it was horrible. Don't tell us our eyes are deceiving us. Fix your crap. Get it together, you guys. I just don't know what else you guys can do to sink yourself. So, and I'm not the only one who feels this, and don't get too worked up with me about it, but your caucus is feeling it, Premier Kenney, obviously. I mean, how out of control is it getting when cabinet ministers are now critiquing you? They're not calling for your resignation yet. Something else interesting out of Leela. One of the things Kenney's been lacking, he really has been a contender for the throne so far. I'm just going to guess here. And my guess, though, is that Leela's got aspirations. She's an ambitious lady. And, if Kenney's out of the way, there's going to be a leadership race. And whether or not I'm barking up the wrong tree or not with that, I suspect there's a little bit of that going on. So that's going to change the whole dynamic for Kenney, too. This has gone now from grumbling backbench MLAs to outright critical cabinet ministers criticizing the premier. He is in a lot of trouble. And what we're going to see now, if they're starting to feel confident that Kenney is going to be pulled out of that leadership role within 6 months, a year, is the unofficial backroom leadership jockeying is going to start. And that's it. He's done. I mean, caucus will all be focused on building their alliances, making their plans, and trying to figure out who they're going to replace Kenney with. Leela here, I can't. She's one of the more progressive in caucus, to say the least. But I mean, that may be the way that some people might want to go with things. That's something that's interesting too. Most of the critique of Jason Kenney from within the caucus has been coming from the more right-leaning end of it. Now it's coming from the left. He's getting it from both sides. The UCP government is in grave trouble. I don't know. I'll leave it at that. We'll move on to some more hypocrisy. Kenney's not certainly got no monopoly on it. An interesting thing to watch over the last week, old Justin Trudeau was jaunting around the planet. He was out in the UK. He's I don't know if he's returned yet or if he's about to return. But, there's a couple of things, and it's in Justin's power. It's in Trudeau's ability. There are a couple of things. One of which is people are saying, why won't you open the bloody American border? They're not putting us at risk. Come on. I mean, they're doing far better than we are, ironically, even though they've opened up much earlier, which gets back to how effective these lockdowns are. So we're all stuck at home. We can't travel. We can't do anything. He's got government business that apparently he couldn't do with a Zoom call, so he flies overseas. But the most galling of all is he comes back, and we've been locking people up in quarantine hotels. We've had issues, literally. A woman was sexually assaulted in one of these quarantine hotels. And this is what we're being enduring. And Justin's coming back, and he's not staying in the quarantine hotel. He's going to a separate little spot away from everybody else. Now, I understand that you can't stick a sitting prime minister in a Super 8, but he should stay in the same bloody hotel as the rest of us if he's going to go through that, even if you've got our paid security to stand outside the door and make sure nobody comes in and harms you. So the hypocrisy of that is pretty bloody galling, as usual. His hypocrisy always is galling. But we've got that coming from the Trudeau government. So Michelle Rempel put a motion forward trying to push, to have Trudeau stay in one of the hotels like the rest. I don't think it'll happen, but at least it does put him on the spot and expose a bit more of just how ugly things are getting. More of that do, as I say, but not as I do. We really got to start firing these people. We really got to get on it. So I see Clinton there in the lobby. Let's get on away from hypocrisy and get on to the never controversial subject and a nice simple one of UFO sightings. Because, How passive could that be? How you doing, Clinton?
Good morning, I should say, to your viewers in Western Canada. How are you today?
Good, thanks. Yeah, I should remind everybody if you haven't seen Clinton on here before, he's coming to us from Nova Scotia. Again, we usually have him on talking about the federal politics, but we'll give that a break for a day. I've been beating on Kenny. We always beat on O'Toole. We'll let O'Toole have a day off. And let's talk about what you brought to my attention. You know, there's been a series of Vice articles. I explained it a little bit in the show opening. We're hearing that stateside. We're hearing it here. Is all these reports of UFOs, particularly with commercial airliners and some military ones. What do we got going on out there, Clinton?
Yeah, so look, first of all, I just want to let your audience know that this is not really a discussion about little green men from Mars. When we're talking about UFOs, we're literally talking about unidentified flying objects. And so one of the concerns is there's this great journalist in Canada that you touched base on. His name is Daniel Otis, and he's written a series of articles for Vice. And he's been interviewing various people connected to the Canadian commercial airline industry and digging up reports and military personnel and all of that kind of stuff. And so what he's uncovered is that over X number of years, there have been some really close calls where, for example, an airline that you're very familiar with in Alberta, WestJet, where they have reported on multiple occasions in British Columbia and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, where cabin crews call air traffic control and say, hey, you know, something has dropped down from 60, 70, 80,000 feet above us. And whatever this object is, it's zigzagging back and forth in sort of, dangerous directions. And obviously, cabin crews and airlines, their number one job is to ensure that people like you and myself and your audience, that we get from point A to point B safely. And the last thing we want in Canada is a potential midair collision. And so, there's been another airline, Porter Airlines. It's a smaller airline that's based out of Ontario, out of the Toronto area. And they were so concerned that they actually had to take evasive maneuvers. And their cabin crew ended up getting injured in the process in order to avoid hitting another one of these UFOs, an unidentified flying object. And we've seen the same reports come out of Air Canada, all thanks to Daniel Otis. And look, this past week, I've sent out some communications, some email requests to members of Parliament in our nation's capital. And there are three committees in particular. So one of them, and forgive me, I'm reading this off of a piece of paper because this is all new kind of information to me.
Yeah.
So one of them is called the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. And I wrote to this committee, as well as the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, and a third committee, the National Committee on Transport. And so what I did was I sent each one of our elected members of Parliament that are on these three respective committees a link to this story that Daniel Otis had written on commercial airlines getting into some potential collisions with unidentified flying objects. And, I said, look, as a concerned private citizen in this country who flies commercial airlines on a regular basis, I would like to know what you are doing to ensure that our skies are safe, that the chances of a midair collision are minimized, and are various government departments sharing information with you. And so that's what caused me to reach out to you, Cory. And I thought, you know what, I'll mention this to you because commercial, air transport safety, the passenger safety. This is a really important issue. There are thousands of aircraft flying over Canada, like from other countries around the world, from within Canada, every day, 24 hours a day during normal, pre and post pandemic times, if you will. So, I consider this to be something that our MPs should be made aware of. And look, I'll give you another example. Again, this is from these reports that I had read from this journalist. So there was a Boeing 747. So for your listeners that may or may not know, a Boeing 747 is like it's either the first or second or third largest airplane in the world. And depending on its configuration, whether it's carrying cargo, for example, or let's say it's just carrying nothing but passengers, you can have 520 people on board one of these airplanes. And do we wait until there's a midair collision or some sort of really serious disaster before our elected officials and our security and defense officials take this issue more seriously? And so that's what caused me to reach out to you.
Yeah, well, and it's an interesting subject, and people have a lot of fun with it. And I mean, it's worthwhile going into the speculation of what all these are. But the main thing, and you said when you talked to me, was the U. We've got to remember these are unidentified. It could be any number of things. And I would guess that chances are a number of these issues were different objects, different things that may or may not have an explanation that we could find. But when we have thousands and thousands of flights per day, it's a matter of time before something dangerous could perhaps occur. If we got things flying through the air and we don't know what the heck they are, it's worth mentioning. And as you said, why so little discussion, almost secrecy on this issue?
Well, look, to your point, to me, that is the real concern, is that, and I'm going to circle this back again to our elected members of parliament. We have these committees that make up multiple political parties across the spectrum that represent our House of Commons, the Parliament of Canada. And I find it concerning that when whether it's myself or a journalist like Daniel Otis or whoever asks our MPs basic questions like, are you aware of these issues? If so, how long have you been aware of them? What are you doing to find out more information about this? Where can we get more information on this? And when all you get back is silence, I consider that quite worrisome. So, for example, one of the things that we've discovered recently, and when I say we, I mean society as a whole, thanks to this journalist, is that if we use NORAD, for example, the North American, air defense folks, they don't have to release files to access the information requests in Canada, nor do they have to release anything in the United States on freedom of information requests. So they can if they choose to, but they're not obligated under any sort of legislation in either the Parliament of Canada or Capitol Hill in Washington. So, that to me is concerning around this issue. We know, for example, that NAV Canada, that they have something called the service reports, which stands for Communications Instructions for Vital Sightings, for vital sightings. So intelligence reports on vital sightings related to commercial aircraft. And hi, Mark, how are you?
I'm excellent. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, so Mark, what I was saying was,
Mark.
oh, that's all right. So, but these are some of the concerns that I have, and then the other thing that's been uncovered recently is that there has been an unclassified intelligence report that actually links the Royal Canadian Air Force with NORAD, Transport Canada, and Canadian Air Traffic Controllers that are, it's essentially a Canadian UFO alert system. And again, we're not talking necessarily about little green men from Mars. We're literally talking about unidentified flying objects. And so the other thing that's worrisome is we know this reporting mechanism exists between NORAD, the Canadian military, the air traffic controllers, and yet they're not giving out any information to the public at large. We're dependent on a great journalist who is dedicating all kinds of time, traveling all over the country and meeting with individuals. And in fact, Mark can touch on this. I believe he interviewed Daniel Otis on his program recently.
Sure. Well, and I'll introduce Mark. I think we've got him there. This is Marc Patrone from Saga 960 out in Mississauga, Ontario. He's come on before, as I said, with Clinton, and usually we're busy beating up on poor Aaron O'Toole. Today we're going to, we're going into UFOs instead, so Aaron can rest easy today. And it is a fascinating subject and something that's been coming up, and people don't really think about. So, Mark, you've caught a bit of where Clinton's been speaking and what he's going on, and you'd had the other journalist on as a guest. You said,
yeah, I spoke with Daniel Otis recently. Intelligent guy, serious guy, somebody who's not prepared to venture into the realm of the woo-woo like others are. I mean, he is careful, as a lot of journalists are when they venture into the realm of UFOs, unidentified flying objects, aerial phenomena, the rest of whatever you want to call it, because they're worried that their own reputations will take a hit, that they'll be ridiculed by their colleagues. And that's one of the reasons why I suspect, gentlemen, that we're not seeing maybe some of the questions that we might have otherwise been hearing from other members of the media. CTV recently spoke with a high-ranking official south of the border about this issue, and it really didn't go beyond, is it aliens or is it not aliens? There's a lot of serious questions. Many of them have been raised by Clinton over the course of this program, Cory, and that is, how dangerous a threat is this? Now, Clinton and I had a bit of a discussion around this, and I can understand in a way why government doesn't want to go there, because as far as we know, there's no communication with these things wherever they are from and whatever they happen to be. So how do you tell them to pick a lane? You know what I'm saying? I mean, their technology is so far ahead. I guess you're hoping that they are into their own self-preservation as much as we are, and they don't want any kind of a mid-air collision as much as we do. So they want to be careful, hopefully. But the idea that we can somehow fix this thing through regulatory action or anything that we can do, I just don't know about that. And maybe that's why governments have been reluctant to open up about this subject. Maybe because they feel there really isn't a whole lot that they can do about it besides talk about it and maybe try to converse with other members of the international community, whether it's the United States or our friends in NATO, Europe, elsewhere, China, Russia. We could talk to these people about what's going on, but beyond that, what do you do about it? I don't really know.
Yeah, well, and I used to fly a lot in my old work in oil exploration and go around. And I got to admit, I've never been a good flyer. I got comfortable with it. I accepted it. But, every time you hit a bit of turbulence, I was gripping that seat arm, and I was always breathing a sigh of relief once we came to a halt on the tarmac at the end of the flight. And yeah, to be honest, if I was thinking about things flying around that may put me at risk, that's going to make me all the more nervous. But at the same time, I'm not the type of person who likes government, the concept that government might be hiding things that put me at risk for the sake of my own comfort. I think maybe make me a little uncomfortable and let me know what's going on out there.
Well, look, I just want to throw something else in there. So in regards to this communications instructions for vital intelligence sightings that NAV Canada has, they're not all this journalist has been putting in requests now for goodness knows how long and saying, can we see these archives? Can we see this database? We'd like to see what's in here. And all this journalist has received is complete silence. So NAV Canada isn't saying anything. This communication with NORAD between Canada and the United States isn't obligated to release anything to citizens in either country. And look, under normal, pre-pandemic and hopefully soon, COVID, when COVID stuff is subsided, Like I normally fly on a very regular basis, like multiple times a month throughout the year. And I want to know when I climb on board an Air Canada flight or a WestJet flight or a Porter Air, you know, whoever it is, I want to know that when I'm getting on that plane in Halifax or Ottawa or Calgary, wherever I am, that I'm going to land at my destination. And, you know, I consider this worrisome. And so, you know, there are other things going on as well. So, for example, Canada has the National Research Council. So some of the questions I have is, are these committees, these parliamentary committees, as far as I know, they haven't done any public consultation with the commercial airline industry, with the air traffic controllers. You know, what are they not sharing with us? What is it that we should know that we don't know? And you know, we have we have a sub sort of government department with the National Research Council, which, you know, uses scientists and this kind of thing to study you know, various things related to transportation and communications. We have the aerospace research division within there. You know, what are we doing here? We've even had American-based airliners flying over Canada that have actually reported objects, you know, basically interfering with their flight path. You know, you're in a plane and this thing just drops down in front of an airplane. What are our members of parliament doing? So look, I'd like to encourage all of your viewers and listeners to your podcast to contact the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, contact the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, and contact the Standing Committee on Transport and say, hey, we want some answers to these questions. It's not good enough to have a wall of silence, especially when we're dealing with such an important issue of safety. You know, it's unacceptable. The same thing with NAV Canada. You know, they should be releasing these files, and if it's nothing, if it's simply some sort of a weather phenomenon, well, that's fine. We can all deal with that, and we can comfortably travel without any worries that something may happen. But if there is some sort of physical object, whatever that object is, whether it's a weather balloon or whether it's another aircraft or it's a drone or something else, you know, our government flight agencies, they have a responsibility to ensure Canadians that they will get to the bottom of it and that they will share that information with Canadians at large. And, you know, and there's another issue on this as well, and this is an issue of national security and defense. So this great journalist, and Daniel touched on this with, I believe, with Marc Patrone when he spoke with him, was that there are military bases in Canada that are reporting these sightings on a regular basis. And if this is a foreign government of some sort, whichever government it is, most people would agree that the primary reason that the sovereign state exists is to provide security to the geographical boundaries of the citizens that live within that sovereign state. And so if our military isn't doing anything about this, then that's also very concerning as well. So sorry, I didn't mean to hog all of the airtime. I'm sure, Mark, you have something to say, and you too, Cory.
Yeah, I mean, everything that you say is true. I don't know how any regulatory body is going to intervene in a matter where these craft are not anything that we understand or know. And I do know that there's a report coming out on June the 25th out of the United States that is supposed to be a massive document dump. And this report hopefully is going to shed some light on what these things are. There's already been a leak. The New York Times published a story recently saying that the only thing the government is going to tell us is that they don't know what these things are. They're not saying they're alien, but they're not saying that they are alien. So in other words, they don't know. All they know is it's not theirs. That's it. That's the one conclusion they have come to. And that's all that's going to come out on June the 25th when these reports come out. I mean, I see no problem with discussing this. But I mean, at the end of the day, if you're worried about UFOs before you get on a plane, nobody's going to guarantee that nothing's going to happen like that before you get on a plane, because they don't have that kind of power. Nobody in government, no regulatory body can say, before you get on an airplane, there's a possibility that you may encounter something outside your window that you don't understand, or see something that appears to be out of this world. And so, if you're that worried about it, then you shouldn't get on an airplane. There's always going to be risks. Nobody's ever going to guarantee that you're not going to run into some kind of issues, whether it's weather related, mechanical related, or something that we don't even understand. So that's one way to look at it from my vantage point. I don't expect government. I guess that's what I'm saying here. I don't expect government. I don't expect any members of parliament. I don't expect any agency or NAVCAN or anybody else to say to me, we guarantee you that when you get on this plane, that you're going to get off on the other side and everything's going to be fine. I don't expect them to do that, because I know that's not something that they can do. They don't have the power to do that. And so, I don't know, that's my take on it. I mean, I'm not saying don't delve into it, don't ask questions. Absolutely, 100%. We need to find out everything that we can. But then to extend it further, to try and get some kind of guarantees from our federal officials that everything is fine, that these things that pilots are encountering are not from another world and they don't mean us harm. I don't expect our governments or anybody else to make that guarantee. That's my take on it, for what it's worth.
Well, look, one of the things I also want to touch on is that this journalist, like, one of the stories he reported was there was a jumbo jet flying in the sky, and the pilot and the co-pilot, experienced pilot with thousands of hours behind the cockpit, they had reported an object dropping down from above 80,000 feet, interfering with their flight path, then taking off in some crazy direction. And according to the pilot, he had calculated that they were, whatever this thing was, it was flying somewhere in the vicinity of Mach 4. And there was some criticism directed at the pilot and the co-pilot, like, how would you know it's Mach 4? And there actually is ways to calculate that. So experienced military pilots, they can actually calculate based off of the altitude that they are from the Earth, and based off of their airspeed that they're going, and based off of the object that they're seeing, and guesstimating an altitude, and then timing the altitude, and then timing the distance that whatever the object is that's moved from a particular point on the radar to another point on the radar, they can actually calculate the speed that way. Now, I know we're getting into the weeds there, but the point is that if this pilot was correct and that he had seen something moving at Mach 4, look, the world's fastest airplane was the SR-71 Lockheed Blackbird, which was capable of flying about Mach 3.2. So whatever this object was that interfered with a Boeing 747 was flying faster than a SR-71 Blackbird. And so this, to me, it's not just a matter of commercial air passenger safety, but it's also a matter of national security. Are there objects that have controlled flight that are able to out-accelerate the most sophisticated military aircraft to be developed in North America? And if there is, then that tells me that that we need to do a better job as Canada, as the United States, as the NORAD body, of ensuring that our technology, our capability, is able to keep up with potential technologies from other nations.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it's other nations we're talking about here. That's the problem. There was no sonic booms as well. I mean, this thing dropped, 1,000 feet. It was 80,000 feet in, a fraction of a second or whatever it was. And there was no sonic booms. I mean, the Chinese don't have that technology. The Russians don't have it. I mean, let's face facts here. We don't know what it is, where it's from, and by all means, ask the questions that need to be asked. But I wouldn't expect any answers. I guess that's, you know what I mean? Like, it's like an ant saying, "Well, I really don't like the way that elephant over there is walking over me, and I think we should raise the issue with somebody." I mean, there is nothing. Who do you talk to? Do you raise it with the Federation, intergalactic? There is no intergalactic federation that you can raise with. I mean, I don't mean to mock this issue, but they don't seem to give a shit or rat's ass what we think. You know what I mean?
Well, it's an area where, I can understand. I don't see any level of government motivated to want to publicly address this on every level you look at. It's like Mark said, if you don't have an answer, well, you don't want to stand there and say, well, yeah, there's something happening. And yeah, we think it's dangerous, but no, we don't know what it is. We can't do anything about it. It's just nothing they want to say.
But hold on. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying, and on the other levels, whether it's an airline too, at the same sense, okay, they've got a concern, they want to talk about these things, but we don't want to be having our passengers all freaked out all the time when they get on. And if it is a military thing, if indeed there is something going on with a foreign nation, well, that's national security, and maybe China did have some bizarre breakthrough, or Russia or Israel or who knows what, and they don't really want to go into that with the public yet. It's just a pretty big rabbit hole, though, so we're still trying to discuss this for sure.
Well, look, I would argue that the reason that we have, military organizations within our respective countries, intelligence organizations, look, we have access to satellite information. We have access to air traffic control, radar information that commercial airlines use every minute of the day, 365 days of the year. I would argue that the first step to finding a solution to this potential problem is to actually gather all of that data. It's to gather that radar data. It's to gather that satellite information and bring some of our brightest minds together within our intelligence community, within the private sector, within the academic setting, and to figure out what are these things that are interfering with commercial air traffic and which are potentially threats to our national security. And I agree that, look, we'll never get to the bottom of it if we don't ask the questions. But I think
we can't dismiss, to be honest, even if it's a long shot. The thing is, when you got secretism, the secretiveness, then you do have speculation is going to come up. And I don't think you can fully dismiss that this might be something from out there. I mean, we're pretty vain to think that in an infinite universe, we're the only ones here. Though we might be a little vain to think we're worth bothering with if any other alien life form comes up with the technology to get here. Maybe that's why they just kind of poke in, they have a look and say, these assholes aren't worth bothering with, and they leave again. But it's an area. I mean, the U is an unknown, and that means you can't really rule anything out any more than you can point at something definitively and say what it is. We just know something is going on.
Yeah, and it's weird. Who knows how far this rabbit hole goes? To what degree are abductions, alleged alien abductions, real? We've been hearing about these for years. The fact that people claims they've been used as lab rats by things we don't understand. And so whatever these things are, assuming they exist, they don't seem to care too much about whether we're bothered by what they're doing or not, any more than insects are when we put them in a jar or, take a frog and dissect it.
But look, I get that, but surely we can all agree that when journalists ask our elected officials that are on these respective committees connected to national defense and security, to commercial air traffic, surely there's an obligation on the part of our members of parliament to actually respond and to actually ask questions. I mean, do we elect individuals, right? Like the
Where do you go with that? I
bureaucracy.
mean, assuming for a minute that the answer is, I don't know what these things are. We don't know where they're from, and that's it. We don't know. We've never spoken to these things. We've caught them on radar. We've seen pictures of things we don't understand. But assuming that it hits that point and it doesn't go any further, then where do you go from there?
But hold on a minute. This is my point. Look, we as citizens, right, we don't work for the bureaucracy, right? Our elected officials work for us, and the bureaucracy works for the elected officials in response to us.
Yeah.
So clearly our elected officials have some responsibility to reach out to the National Research Council, to reach out to the Canadian Air Force, to reach out to the air traffic controllers, to reach out to the Aerospace Research Division within the National Research Council.
To what end, Clinton? What are you expecting to get out of these bodies? Do you think that they're hiding something? They can do something? Do you think they can get on the horn and call, the Klingons and say, "Hey, man, you guys pick a lane"? No, I'm just honestly asking, what are you expecting to get back from these people?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would like to see them do is ask questions to these various bureaucratic agencies, what information that they have that they can share with our members of parliament. I mean, that's the first thing. And the second thing is, if they come back to our members of parliament and they say, well, we don't have anything, and, we've never bothered to look at what object A is that's interfering with a Boeing 747 flying at 40,000 feet. Well, surely our elected representatives can then instruct the bureaucracy to gather data, to collect information, to come up with a hypothesis, to analyze whatever this is.
They've been looking at it for years, and as far as I know, they don't know what it is. I mean, they might know things that we don't know. They might be hiding stuff. Maybe they're saying, well, look, there's no point telling the public this stuff because they're just going to get alarmed. And at the end of the day, there's nothing we can do about it. But I agree with you. Ask the question. But I'm just trying to imagine once you get an answer back from people that are saying, all right, yeah, we know things are out there. We don't know what they are, where they're from, and we don't know what to do about it. Then what?
So then one of the things I guess you could say, I mean, if there is a valid concern, I mean, to get back to it, though, I mean, that one report did have 2 flight attendants get injured. There was a risk. Maybe, I don't know. I always get nervous about asking government to strike more committees or investigations, but perhaps it's worth getting a few of them, even if they say we don't have an answer, but we'll gather these 5 people and give a modest budget and task them in the next 3 months to actually dig into this, though, so we can say whether there is an answer or a hazard or a risk going on. Because otherwise, it'll be people like us speculating about it.
Yeah, I think, it has dawned on me just listening to you there, Cory, and Clinton. Maybe one of the reasons why these organizations have not been very forthcoming about what they know is that once they give us what they know, which is, yeah, we've seen this and we've seen that, then people are going to demand the very things that Clinton is demanding from these people, which is, well, what are you going to do about it? And they know that there's nothing that they can do about it. All they can do is observe, because we don't have the technology or anything else to be able to communicate or to stop what is going on. Assuming that it's something that we don't understand, even from an intergalactic vantage point, at the end of the day, there really is nothing we can do about it. And so maybe these various bodies, regulatory, governmental, and military, know there's nothing we can do about it. So they keep the stuff to themselves because they know that at the end of the day, they are powerless to do anything about it. And they don't want to have to deal with that from a public that's going to be demanding action.
Well, look, I mean, to Cory's point, we know we have agencies that are connected to science, to aviation, to security. These agencies exist and we pay them. So, I mean, Cory, I would argue that there's nothing wrong with asking departments, the bureaucracies that work for us already, that are employed by us to look after these issues, to ask them, what is it that you know? And if you know nothing, can you help us find answers to some of these questions? I mean, do we wait until, God forbid, a Boeing 737 flying from Halifax to Calgary is involved in a midair collision? Is that when every journalist across Canada starts asking questions? Do we wait for something like that to happen? Or do we start asking questions before something were to happen?
You think there's a way to avoid a midair collision with a UFO? You think that there's tell me what would be the preventative measures for that?
Well, look, I'm not an expert on this matter. I'm
asking you, what would be the preventative action apart from not flying? I mean,
I'll give you an example.
That wouldn't happen.
Okay, well, I'll give a quick example. Let's say, for example, that there's 100 cases that are reported, let's say hypothetically, every year to the air traffic controllers of Canada. And of those 100 cases that happen every year, let's say hypothetically that 50 of them happen in one particular geographical footprint. Let's say they happen above the border of Manitoba and Ontario at an altitude of, let's say, 35,000 feet. And we know that there's a recurring pattern where it's happening every X number of days at a particular altitude over a particular geographical footprint. Well, we could instruct our aviation authorities to, we could then look at that data and say, you know what? Let's avoid this piece of airspace on these particular days to minimize a potential risk.
You're saying a UFO no-go zone. So we say this area of Canada is a UFO no-go zone. We're relinquishing that to the aliens. We're just going to go around.
I'm not saying aliens at all. What I'm saying is, let's say there's somebody on the ground that's releasing weather balloons, like some other agencies.
I think if they were weather balloons, we'd know about it. I mean, we could deal with weather balloons.
But I mean,
these things are not behaving like weather balloons.
But
going Mach 4 is not a weather balloon thing.
But what I'm saying is we don't know if it's a weather balloon. And I'm using that as an example. Like, if we know that there's something in a particular piece of airspace, well, that gives us something to investigate. Or to Cory's earlier point, that allows the civil aviation authorities to say, you know what? Let's avoid this because of the threat of a midair collision. But to simply stick our heads in the sand and say, we're not going to look at this.
Don't go there. Don't avoid UFO hotspots. So planes would be.
Yeah, well, again, when we say UFOs, like for your audience, we're talking about unidentified flying objects.
I know that's what a UFO is, but that's fine. Okay, so I asked you for a preventative, and you've offered me one. That's an interesting suggestion. I never thought of that. UFO no-go zones. I would never recommend something like that, but at least it's a suggestion.
It's something. Well, I mean, again, to look into it, though. I mean, to Clinton's point a bit, if there's patterns, if there's areas, like if we could get a little more communication on what these reports are, perhaps there's something we could start investigating, or perhaps it gets back to not seeing anything. The one thing that seems to be a pattern, though, I guess, is this is always at a high elevation. Like one of the things that made Bigfoot disappear and the Ogopogo and the Loch Ness Monster was the proliferation of smartphones. Because suddenly, you would think when we've got billions of people with a camera in their hand all the time, we'll finally be able to prove all these things, and they've all vanished. These whatever these items are, though, we're not getting an increase in people seeing it from the ground or while they're traveling or at the beach. This is predominantly among pilots and other aircrafts, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want you to think that I'm suggesting we do nothing except just shrug our shoulders and say, well, that's the way it is. I'm not saying that. And what I am saying is, yeah, by all means, monitor. By all means, observe and report. Observe and report, right? And let us know what the hell's going on, and stop treating us like children. That if our regulatory bodies, if our military knows things, they should absolutely level with the people and not treat us as if we're too stupid to understand or that we can't handle the truth. Okay, so I'm all in favor of observing and reporting. I guess my expectations of being able to do anything about any of these sightings pretty much ends there. I don't think there's anything we can do. This has been going on for decades.
Well, hold on. I'll give another example. So to go back to the idea of
a UFO
potential patterns.
No-go zone, okay.
Yeah, well, just similar sorts of things. So let's say, for example, that by figuring out a particular pattern and by gathering satellite data and radar data and all of this kind of stuff, that they go, you know what? There is someone in Toronto, let's say, that is flying drones, aerial photography drones, within a certain distance of whatever air traffic it is. Well, we may be able to actually figure out the day and the time, and then we could actually, I hate to say it, but we could send authorities to visit whoever this person is and to say to that person, you know what? We understand you want to use your drone. That's perfectly fine. We're okay with that. The problem is where you're using this drone, you're directly interfering with a passenger aircraft.
But that's not a UFO, though. That is an unidentified flying object. We know what that is, and we know that there are people involved. I'm talking about things that we don't know that are being reported. And the other thing is that these sightings have been around military sites. So a lot of times they've been reported around missile silos, for instance. There have been reports that these things have actually, and I don't know if you believe it or not, but they come from on high, that they've actually turned off missiles. They've actually turned off nuclear missile sites. They've actually, and it precipitated communication between then President Reagan and the Soviet Union, because there was threats of war that came out of that. So Reagan and whoever it was at the time, Gorbachev or whomever, had to communicate with each other and say, do you know, are you guys doing this? Because if you are, stop it. And they're saying, no, we thought you were doing it to us. So,
well, look,
that's handy. I mean, that kind of communication is important.
And I'm getting up against the clock here, but I mean, it's something to Mark's point, though, is that, this has been happening. There might be some high atmosphere things that happen that we still just haven't figured out quite yet, since the 70s, 80s, military aircraft getting to higher elevations. But, I'm just glad you came on. We can talk about something, like I said, a little less political, and it's worth talking about, and it's worth looking into. I appreciate that Clinton actually is communicating with the people, though.
Yeah, I do too.
We'll see if we get an answer, that they're valid questions. And we'll, again, I think that part of the problem is it's probably unlikely to get an answer, but you'll never find out without asking. So,
that's very true. And
so I'll let you guys kind of wrap up here. I'm going to get on to Greg and on to some more drier political stuff, but it's refreshing to get away from, the politics now and then. So I appreciate that.
Thanks, guys. Great
well, listen, I'd like to thank you for having me on, and I enjoyed this. And just to wrap this up, to your listeners, please contact our National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, the Standing Committee on Public Safety, and the Standing Committee on Transport, and ask them these questions. We'll never know unless we ask questions.
Very true. An excellent point, Clinton. Thanks, guys. Great talking about.
And Mark, you're on Saga 960 for
Saga
those.
960, that's right. News Talk. Check it out.
Clinton,
9 a.m.
You
Eastern.
can find me on Twitter at Clinton Desveaux.
Right on. Thanks a lot, guys. It's always fun getting you on.
See ya.
I'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
Okay. So I know some people got frustrated. We talked about UFOs and things, but there was a valid point, to some degree of that. Again, is there a safety risk? Is there something going on? It doesn't mean you're speculating necessarily about, living long and prospering, as Cindy's pointing out, or little green men coming. But there are real reports. There have been real incidents happening in the air, and it's worth asking a few questions. So before I get on to Greg and some political stuff, I'll just remind everybody of our sponsors as well. We've got Resistance Coffee. For those who weren't on in the early part of the show, go to Resistance Coffee there. Order these guys, give 10% of all the coffee sales, the purchase will go towards causes that stand up for your individual rights, like the JCCF, things like that. If you go to resistancecoffee.com and use the promo code Western Standard for your first order, you'll get 10% off on that order. Get your coffee from them. Some of those funds go towards good causes, standing up for your individual rights. You get some good coffee. I got to get more of those names. It's just that Liberal Tears brand that they've got out there that stands out for me. They got some great humorous names for them. And don't let the names deceive you. It's quality coffee. They're just having some fun with it. It doesn't always have to be dry. And our other sponsor there, the CCFR, which is the Canadian Council for Firearms Rights, they're standing up for your right to use and own firearms, and they've been sponsoring our shows, the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. Go to firearmrights.ca. These guys are sponsoring us. They're helping us, and these guys are helping you. They're standing up for your rights to own and use firearms. So be sure, visit our sponsors. It helps for all of us. Now, I'll get on to Greg Renouf. I've spoken to Greg before in the past on my podcast with just audio there. And Greg has, as I said before at the start of the show, he really is focused and likes covering protesters, protests, those organizations, things like that. As I've said, he's almost like the Andy No of Canada in some senses, digging into those things where all you really typically see is a headline, and don't really get to see a little more on what's actually going on with it. So thanks for joining me today, Greg.
Hi, thanks for having me. Apologies for the video quality today. I had a water accident.
It's okay. Yeah, I won't go into it, but I've got some laptop issues due to dropping mine on the floor. It's still functional, though. We can hear you, and that's what's most important. So I appreciate you coming on. I've seen you on Twitter, pointing out some things, talking about things, and one that's been, again, we see snippets of in the news, and it's been ongoing for quite a while, is the Fairy Creek logging project. Can you lay out a bit of what's been happening out there?
Yeah, the Fairy Creek logging protest started last year, and it's a group of what I would call the usual suspects of anti-logging and environmental groups who set up a camp up near the two First Nations, the Pachidat and the Dididat, who have agreements with the provincial government, and they've signed and to log the local area. The protesters say it's old growth logging and that should be stopped. I guess there's a lot of different numbers I've heard. They say that many things, there's 1% of old growth logs left, 20% old growth logs left in BC. But the interesting part is every part the protesters do, they will have a land acknowledgement. So they will say, we're on the unceded land of the Pachidat and the unceded land of the Dididat. And they've gone as far as setting up a teepee on their protest to show that they are pro-First Nations. There's a couple problems with this, though. The first is that we don't use teepees in the West Coast. They use longhouses. So they're completely appropriating the culture of the Eastern First Nations and bringing it to the West. And the two First Nations in question actually want the logging to go on. And so the protesters are putting up this show that they are pro-First Nations and they are helping the First Nations and they're fighting for First Nation sovereignty. But the truth of the matter is they're actually fighting against them.
Yeah, we've seen that before. I mean, that's happened with the Coastal GasLink line. Very controversial on some of the people we found and some of the protests that happened over that in Vancouver and BC. People self-identifying as natives, it turned out that actually weren't even First Nations whatsoever. But, it's difficult. Media won't necessarily ask somebody to back up their credentials on what their genetic background may be. But we see the First Nations identity being abused sometimes for these environmental causes.
Yeah, it's been happening a lot more lately than in the past. But if you look at the Pachidat First Nation is about 290 people in population. The Dididat First Nation is about 350 people. And there's about 1,000 people out there protesting against the two. And they have thousands of people around the world sending them money. They've raised half a million dollars so far. So it's not just fighting against the First Nation, they're crushing the First Nation. And how can a small community of 290 people fight against thousands of people around the world sending money and resources to stop them from earning a living.
Yeah, and I noticed they've pulled in some of the usual suspects on celebrity fronts to come out against this. Ones who've probably never set foot, outside of the major centers in Canada if they visited at all. And it's frustrating to watch these things. Like right now, one of the things we're seeing that's impacting cost of living and is harming a lot of people is the high cost of lumber. And I've worked a lot in oil field exploration, things like that, but I traveled a lot. And there is a lot of old growth forest. I mean, none of us want to see it leveled or ruined or turned into a desert or anything. But with responsible harvesting, we can definitely be utilizing some of these. But these protesters are basically kind of on an all or nothing approach on these issues.
Oh, you're breaking up. I didn't hear that last part.
Oh, that's quite all right. I was saying it's we're not getting a nuanced approach from protesters when it comes to these logging projects. They're not asking to have logging happen in a different area, or they don't feel that it could be done in a responsible way. John Gormley is a radio host I love out of Saskatchewan. I'm pretty sure he's the one who coined the term. He used to call them paves, which are people against virtually everything. And when you get this group, there's not really any way to reason with them because they're going to oppose any development whatsoever. Do we still have you there, Greg? I might be having some technical difficulties with Greg, I'm afraid, over there. Hopefully he can kind of reconnect and get back in with us here. But for those who've been watching it, yeah, it's an ongoing trend. As I said at the start of the show, Sephora Berman, I don't know if these are birth names for some of these protesters or if they just get their hippie name later on in life or whatever it is. It's the same old people who show up at these protests. They just won't give any ground. And something of an irony, yes, these tend to be quite left-wing. These are the social justice warriors, yet they won't hesitate for a second to appropriate culture. As he pointed out, they got a teepee on Vancouver Island. That is a Plains native device and home. It has nothing to do with what's going on out there. If anybody done it in any other context, in fact, they'd be canceled rather quickly by the cancel culture bunch. But these guys feel, I guess, if they're saving the world, they're saving the trees and the fluffy bunnies and such, that they're justified in utilizing whatever means are at their disposal. But it's also unfair to the many First Nations people who do rely on these projects, who are working on these. I mean, we saw that in the oil field as well. Another irony, these social justice warriors, these protesters love to call anybody and everybody a racist. Yet at the same time, they speak for First Nations as if First Nations all are of hive mind, as if they all think the same way, as if First Nations are all just one entity. And that bloodline means they're all going to have the same kind of thought. And when you think of it that way, these social justice warriors are actually, that's racism at its most base definition. That's saying if you have these genetics, you automatically think this way. That's absolutely wrong. And they're using First Nations people as a shield for their actions, which is actually odious, and they need to be called out more for this. I mean, certainly there's some First Nation individuals concerned about that logging, but you can't say that they're all in the same boat like that. They obviously aren't. Some of them want to make a living out there. Some of them want to see some responsible harvesting of a resource in their area. Now, I think we've got Greg back. How you doing there, Greg?
Hi, I'm back. Sorry about that.
Oh, quite all right. So, I was just going on a bit more on how the protesters kind of pull out all the stops, and they're, almost a bit hypocritical, as you said, when they take on a cultural appropriation with things like teepees and put up First Nations issues as a shield in front of them. We don't hear enough about the First Nations people are being put out of work when these projects get shut down like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same thing happening here that we see happening up in the Wet'suwet'en gas pipeline protest, that they're just crushing the local communities. And we don't get to hear from the local communities. The media doesn't talk to the people who want the pipeline or the people who want to cut the logs. They only talk to the people who don't. In this case, it's also the politicians, which I find particularly disturbing. The Green Party has taken a really large place in this protest. They've had politicians up there. They're making statements of support. Well, the Green Party prides itself on its support of First Nations and support of First Nation sovereignty. But there.
I think we may have lost Greg again, I'm afraid. But yeah, the Wet'suwet'en issue that Greg brought up was a very similar thing. This is where environmentalists latched on to the concept of hereditary chiefs, which again gets into there's traditions with hereditary chiefs, but they're going to kind of utilize the rules and bend them to whatever their own personal agenda and need is, and they feel justified in doing so as long as they feel it's worthwhile for their cause. Now, in the case of that with the Coastal GasLink, I mean, every single First Nations band along that pipeline right away had given consent and permission for development along that line. They were looking forward and are looking forward to, and they're taking advantage of the opportunities it brought them for work, for making a living and things such as that. And I mean, something I wish more media would ask these protesters who get their money from foreign funding quite often from large corporations or organizations or some well-funded people in Canada even, what do they want these people who live in isolated areas to do then? What is their vision? What do they feel that these First Nations people are going to do to pay their bills? I mean, hunting and trapping is done. Sustenance living is done. We're in the modern world, and in doing responsible timber harvesting, that there's an opportunity. Greg, did you ever hear these protesters talk about what the plan would be then if these projects that they want shut down actually get shut down?
No, but that leads to an interesting thing I've observed. The money that's been raised by the protests is over $500,000 so far. The money raising is done by a guy named Yogi Shambhu, who's a New Age guru who teaches like tantric sex courses and such. But he's brought in $500,000. There's been this conversation within the protest of maybe we can, rather than fight against the First Nation, we can take that money we've earned and give it to them. And the interesting thing was that the protesters who want to have a protest, they don't really care, it seems. They got really angry and they started cutting people off to suggest that they could have positive movements to help the community. Personally, in my opinion, they're not there to help the community. They're there to help themselves.
Well, yeah, these protesters came in from outside. I mean, that's an isolated area of Vancouver Island. They don't live in the neighborhood. They came out there with the express purpose of stopping what's going on. And I find it pretty insulting to those citizens of those areas and those First Nations people that these outsiders are coming in and telling them what's good for their area and what isn't.
Absolutely. But the other thing that I've noticed watching these protests, and from my understanding of history of British colonialism, is the British didn't take over India, for example, by shooting guns and biting people and killing them. The British took over India by making agreements with disaffected members of communities and bringing them on to be leaders and to elevate people who were on their side. This is exactly the same sort of colonialism that's going on with these protesters. If you look, there's mainly two visible locals at the protest from the Apache First Nation. There's Bill Jones, who's been called, they call him their spiritual leader. And there's a Victor Peter, a young man who's they're calling a hereditary chief. There are no hereditary chiefs in the Apache First Nation. That tradition had died. Bill Jones, who's the person they're showing on all of their advertisements and all of their promotions, he's not a hereditary chief. And he's being pushed by the protesters, and no one is talking to anyone but him. The media isn't talking to the people in the First Nation. But his niece, who is a spokesperson for him, she's actually the Indigenous Community Engagement Facilitator for the Sierra Club. So like the Sierra Club and the NGOs are going in the community and they're recruiting people who are disaffected and bringing them on their side and fighting the entire community.
Well, and some of these names, you mentioned and you called them the usual suspects. That's the term I use as well. You can tell that they're familiar with them. you're familiar with them, so you know these names from other protests in other areas over the years as well, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Like one of the more visible protesters there is Barbie Arbus and Saul Arbus. They're a father and son team. Bobby Arbus was named on the injunction at the Burnaby Mountain protests against the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We had Tespora Berman show up for her of stand.org, stand.earth, to do her traditional arrest. We have the same traditional NGOs. We have the stand.earth, the BC Civil Liberties Association is helping them, Sierra Club, Suzuki Foundation, Wilderness Committee. And it's all the who's who in the same protests that happened across the province. There's a whole industry in this, right?
Yeah, and some of the spokespeople at these things, they're well organized, they're often well educated and well funded. But these protests and these encampments, they tend to populate them. We've seen that across the country, whether it was all the way back to Occupy or Idle No More or other areas, with sometimes some very disturbed or distressed people. You see those ones surfacing all over the place too, but they don't necessarily even always know what the cause is. They just kind of travel from protest to protest to, I guess, gain a sense of purpose.
Well, it's also a lot of fun, right? Setting up a camp in the woods and having a big protest. It's a good time. There's a lot of people who follow the protest circuit like a party circuit. It's very similar.
Yeah, and I've seen that from attending, Occupy camps, the Camp Cloud thing they had going on in Burnaby for a while till they pushed it too far. And even to a degree on the Coastal GasLink protest sites. And we're going to see more of this, but is there much will on the part of the authorities to break these things up, though? It just seems that as much as there seems to be no legal basis for blocking these projects, we can't seem to find the will to just get in and say, that's enough, guys. You've expressed yourself. Things are moving ahead.
Yeah, to be fair and to be fair to the RCMP, they have a really hard job trying to arrest 1,000 people in the middle of nowhere when they're tying themselves up to trees and making it very difficult to be arrested. The courts aren't really responding very strongly, though, and as they probably should. There are people who are getting arrested and going right back up to the camp. The protesters who put themselves up in the trees or build tripods so they're difficult to be arrested. In America, that's treated as a aggravating factor in a criminal trial. So people don't make it more difficult to get arrested because all that effort that the police will have to take them down from the tree or to dig them up from the ground is they're held responsible for that. But in Canada, you get arrested and you go back and you do it again and nobody cares.
Yeah, you can't fault the police too much. I mean, how many times do you want to arrest the same person over again, particularly in dangerous arrests and at height and things like that? And it's funny, we saw that with parallel protests. The head of Alberta Greenpeace and a number of others all went and strung themselves like a bunch of idiotic piñatas off a bridge in Vancouver. And they had to do high-level, very dangerous rescue work with emergency services officials, taking their time and their resources. They charged all these guys, and they dropped all the charges. So who won? I mean, you put emergency personnel at risk. You blocked a major important thoroughfare. What message does it send it to these protesters that says you do have impunity?
Absolutely. And the media kind of plays into this too. They help out the protesters in getting lower treatment, I guess. Remember that the protesters, when they're getting arrested, let me jump back a step. Years ago, when I was in the movement, I went through training on how to run a protest and a direct action. One of the things they teach you in this protest and course is how to get arrested, right? How to get arrested is not how to put your hands behind your arms and make sure that you do everything properly. It's how to scream like a banshee and act like you're being beaten up and like roughed and brutalized by the police. If you look at some of the videos here of the protests, they're doing the same thing. They're acting and they're screaming and they're acting like the police are beating them up, but they're not. And the media just takes that clip of video and shows it and turns them into heroes.
Yeah, and that's a frustrating thing.
Okay.
No problem. But yeah, just a frustrating thing. The media does take it selectively. Again, if it bleeds, it leads. Let's make this controversial. But I've seen that. I watched a case. I know exactly what you're talking about in Occupy Calgary. And there was this woman who had warrants, and they took her and they put her into the van. And the screaming and yelling, you'd think they'd snapped half the bones in her body. But she was a terrible actress. Anybody standing there would realize this was a bunch of baloney on her part. But the thing was with that, the only place you could see it was YouTube because the media was all around, but none of that made the media's news that night.
Yeah. I think half the problem we have here is the media is just not reporting on what's happening properly. When the media is trying to help.
So we've got a lot of levels of problem. People aren't quite getting a proper picture, and we aren't perhaps having follow through with some of these protests. I mean, it's a right to protest, it's a right, but eventually that line gets crossed. Same with hanging off bridges and that. I know a bunch of protesters pulled that stunt down in Texas too, and those Texas police had them off of there so fast, and they were charged heavily. I think some of them might still be in jail. And you know what? It hasn't happened since. It seems it works if you follow through with charges with these guys.
Yeah, I think it would. If there was some reason to fear behaving the way they do, they would probably not do that.
So as you've been watching the protesters and everything, in some senses, the pandemic really quieted down a year of, the BLM stuff exploded. So they expended a lot of energy on that last summer because, again, it's usually the same people at these, just that they latch on to whatever cause is coming month by month. We've got Trans Mountain approaching, it keeps getting in fits and stalls, whether it ever gets done or not. But there's some very vigorous opposition to it. Are you seeing other protest groups like getting ready for this year now that they can legally or non-pandemic restriction-wise get back out in the streets and start doing what they like doing again? Is there going to be more of this coming soon, do you think?
I think there are more protests coming up in the East Coast with the lobster fisheries. That seems to be getting ready to heat up again. In Toronto this week, they tore down the statue of Ryerson yesterday.
Yeah.
Ryerson University. I don't know if you saw my postings on Twitter, but I found the people who cut the head off bragging about tearing apart the statues and arguing that they're going to start tearing down more statues across the city. So I think we're going to see a bit more statue tearing down this year.
Yeah, they will keep tearing them down until we do something about it. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I was here in Montreal when they tore down the Donald statue. No one did a thing about it.
No, it's just an unfortunate state of disorder, especially when we're in a year of attempted recovery. But we'll keep an eye on things, I guess, and hopefully some reason can prevail at some time. Where can people find more information on what you're up to and what you're reporting on? Because I do appreciate you getting out there because you're watching these closely and letting us know. We don't all have time to cut through the protesters' baloney. We need to just keep up from folks like you helping see what's going on there.
Well, for right now, there's my Twitter account, Renouf, Grenouf, which I put out most of what I'm finding. I'm trying to start another website in the short term, but I haven't got to that yet. My current website is genuinewitty.com, GENUINEWITTY.com, which is a good archive of my work in the past.
Yeah, you had some great videos there. Just to remind people that Genuine Witty, it's a good site. Even if it's past protests, you've got some great work on there. And really helps give people insight into some of these protesters and how it's the same people over and over again and some of the tactics they use.
Yeah, that was the greatest revolution. The greatest thing I learned out of the Occupy movement was it's the same people running the same protests coast to coast and coast to coast. Just one of my more interesting finds recently is the person I knew from Occupy Toronto who was organizing protest there. She was over organizing the lobster sales in New Brunswick. Like they moved across the country, the same people doing the same things.
Yeah, well, and social media has given them a whole new means to organize, but it also gives us a whole new means to expose these guys and what they're doing. So we'll keep on them, and hopefully, again, we get some rationality as the season progresses there. So thanks for joining me, Greg. And
a lot more people can.
Have we got you there?
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay, sure. Sorry. Yeah, you bet. I'll talk to you later, Greg.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.
So yeah, I don't. Last year was a summer of protests with BLM. Things with the Coastal Gas Link again. The pandemic almost brought that to an end. Rather than authorities, I think some authorities were gasping a sigh of relief when they didn't have to intervene with blocked railroad tracks and other issues that were happening across the country. But these protesters don't stop, and as I said earlier, they aren't rational. They aren't reasonable. And we do have to push back on them. As Pamela is saying here, yeah, we're going to see vigilante justice soon. And you know what? If the state doesn't shape up and start doing something about this, then people will get up. And that's dangerous, And I mean, people got on my case because I organized people to go out and potentially go after Camp Cloud to clean it up. That did help prompt the RCMP to go in and do it. They didn't want to. It's a messy, ugly job. As Greg was pointing out, the charges tend not to stick, and how much time can they dedicate towards it? But we can't just keep letting this go on. We've got to let our economy get rolling here. We've got to quit bending over for these protesters. There's 1,000 of them up there in the Fairy Creek area. And yeah, they got $500,000. Like, this money is pouring into these guys. But 1,000 people out of all of Canada, like, these are just in the whole scope of things. It's a small minority of extremists. But we let them call the shots, and we have to stop doing that. We're all paying a terrible economic price, and it's not good for society. Free expression is one thing, but this chronic undercutting of our industries is hurting people all over the place, and we got to push back. So Greg's been doing a bit of that. I'm going to finish up here with speaking on the UCP. They've been having a difficult time. As I said, Kenny has got definitely a caucus revolt going on. We'll see if he can manage to quell this or not. It's really not looking very good. But something that again has been coming up is I'm seeing the rhetoric, because they've talked about shutting down the Chumir safe injection site in downtown Calgary. And the rhetoric has been heated. The usual activists and arseholes. One professor I saw saying this is the equivalent of Kenny shutting down a COVID testing site. No, it's not. Cut it out. The opioid epidemic is a crisis. It's a big one. And what they didn't overlook, and I said it, I believe, on Friday as well, I give credit where it's due. Naheed Nenshi jumped in upset about that pending closure, but then said he looked farther into it and realized that, no, this wasn't out of spite. In fact, there's 2 more locations are going to be opened to make up for the closure of that one, which will be in more appropriate areas. And it's not NIMBYism. It's not minor stuff we're talking about. The numbers that are going on in the last year in that area where the safe consumption site was, down in Beltline, Calgary, at the Sheldon Chumir Center, the police have had a 286% rise in calls. Just that little area. You're asking a heck of a lot of citizens, residents, people with children, when you're going to take their neighborhood and flood it with addicts and dealers, because that's what happens when you bring these centers in. You draw them in. They're not buying their drugs from a pharmacy. The dealers follow the addicts, and the dealers are usually scumbags. They're dangerous people, and the addicts are desperate, so they steal things. That's what happens. Now, Kenny, again, I've talked about that in the past. He's looking at getting 4,000 treatment beds to try and reduce the number of addicts, and they've also expanded 2 more of those treatment centers to make up for what's going to happen when the Chumir Center closes, because, of course, if they do overdose and die, we can't treat them and we can't get them better. We do want to mitigate harm and hopefully get these people back into the world. But the Albertan saying 1 or 2 good decisions doesn't erase all its harms. No, it doesn't. I just like to try and cover a bit of everything. Even though I get tired of constantly going on about the harms. There's other parties, we talk to them. I just want to point out sometimes they get things right. And when they do, I want to speak to it when it happens, because I spend so much time on what they're doing wrong. So one of the other thing they're doing right, again, better late than never. I don't know. I mean, we've spent a year on it. We'll be spending years talking about it, but the reopening is coming. Too late? Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say too late. I mean, it's got to happen eventually. It could be later. By the sounds of Notley, it would be another 6 months if she were still in power. So it could be worse, but it could most definitely better. I think we should have been open months ago. We've seen in Texas, Florida, around the world, areas with less vaccination, fewer vaccinations than we do, opened up, and they were fine. The impact that lockdowns have on pandemic spread are clearly negligible. You see those patterns. You see those graphs when you lay out jurisdictions around the world, some with strong regulations, some with light ones. And you know what? The ebb and flow of infections and patterns is pretty much exactly the same. It's just human vanity that makes them think that government can somehow legislate their way out of a pandemic. All they can do is legislate us out of prosperity and take away our freedoms. So I segue back into our sponsors as I close things off. Speaking of our freedoms, I'll start with the CCFR. They've been sponsoring our shows. This is how we can get this content to you. Sponsors, subscriptions. If you haven't subscribed to the Western Standard, get in there and subscribe. It's great content for the value, for the price. And otherwise, the advertisers help us along here with the CCFR. Don't forget, nobody works harder for gun owners than the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights. That's what the CCFR stands for there. And the CCFR is suing the federal government on behalf of gun owners. They're suing the state and the government. They're doing this for you, doing it for me. So let's get out there and support them. They can't just do it all by themselves. Become a member or donate to their legal fund. Go to firearmrights.ca and click Why Join. So just one more time, that's firearmrights.ca. Click on Why Join. Those guys will stand up for you, make sure you can continue to enjoy your firearms, and hopefully your children and grandchildren can too. We've got to stand up for our rights. They're always under threat, unfortunately. As well, then, our other sponsor there, the new one, these guys are fun, they're witty, Resistance Coffee Company. They got the crossed rifles up top there. Yeah, these guys aren't bound by political correctness. They aren't woke. They're a company that's producing coffee. And, again, if you're tired of having that woke political correctness rammed down your throat wherever you turn, tired of, frustrated, you give your money to buy something and find out that business is giving the money to one of their woke causes, well, Resistance Coffee Company's here for you. So you can get good quality coffee. And not only is that money not going to go towards Greenpeace or the Sierra Club or any of those crazy clowns who are trying to shut down your means of making a living or living your free life. Not only are they not going to give it to them, they're actually giving 10% of that to causes like the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms to fight for your ability to remain free as a citizen and move around and do things. So it's important. Let's all support each other. This is a great way where it's not even just a straight donation to a cause. You're buying something, you're getting some coffee. They're going to give 10% towards an important cause that helps you. Everybody wins. They sponsor us. I can keep ranting at you on this platform. And you can get another 10% off when you go to it, it's resistancecoffee.com. There's all types on there, all kinds of different coffees. You can order it, get it delivered. Go to resistancecoffee.com, and there's a promo code Western Standard. And you type in that promo code Western Standard, and you'll get 10% off your coffee at that. So, hey, that's a fantastic deal. Great coffee. Frustrate and annoy the woke left. Support our sponsor. It's just win, win, win. And you can have a great morning waking up and drinking their medium roast, which is called Liberal Tears, which is fantastic. So next Friday, I will be back on tomorrow from 10 till noon, the same time slot. We've got Nathan Gita with his Mountain Standard Time. He'll be speaking on some things. Wednesday, I'll be on with the Pipeline around noon with Derek and Dave, as usual, where we run down the news for the week. Friday, I've got mayoral candidate Brad Field coming on, and I have a gentleman coming on to talk about cryptocurrencies. If you have any other questions, topic suggestions, things like that, guest suggestions, email them to me, cmorgan@westernstandardonline.com. Thank you all for joining me today, and keep fighting the good fight. I will see you all on Wednesday.